Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the show. The campaign is only a week away as of today, and so here today to discuss what the various parties have to do in order to win the campaign, who is best for the job, and some of the qualities and characteristics that all of the people, or rather all of the party leaders, have, both good and bad. Is Stephanie Levitz. She's a parliamentary reporter for the Toronto Star. Lucas Meyer is a senior consultant for media and public affairs at Enterprise Canada, and his second time on the show in the past week. So thanks for coming back on.
My pleasure.
Celina Ceaser Chavannes, former MP and former parliamentary secretary to the Prime Minister. She's also the author of her book titled "Can You Hear Me Now?" And also joining me is Fatima Syed, host of the Backbench Political Podcast, and a reporter who spends the majority of her time covering climate and social justice. So hello to all of you, and thank you for joining me. Celina, let me start with you. It's really good to be able to chat with you again. So I think kind of the obvious thing is you were on the West Block with Mercedes Stephenson just yesterday, in which, you broke some news that was kind of made headlines that you would be supporting the Conservative candidate in your riding. And you kind of said that, even though you're a lifelong liberal, sometimes, you can change. And so why have the Conservatives earned your support in this campaign? And why do you believe that the Conservative candidate, Malia Shahid, in your riding is the best one to advance Whitby forward?
So thank you very much, Wyatt, for having me, and thank you to the other guests who are on. So I did, in fact, announce that yesterday and today in advance polling at the Whitby Royal Legion. I did cast my ballot for Malia Shahid, and it's because I know Malia. And I've been getting several calls from friends and family and others who have said, Celina, why would you give the Conservatives your vote? Why would you change direction? Why would you look at their track record and, as a liberal, continue to give them your support? And that is really around the fact that how do you reconcile a track record of a government that I've been a part of that has said to me, that we are going to do certain things. We're going to repeal mandatory minimums. We're going to get rid of boiled water advisories and not do it, versus a party who doesn't have it in their platform and is saying the same thing. Well, we are having conversations about doing it. So it's 6 eggs, half a dozen for me at this point. And I think that at this point, we cannot continue to reward bad behavior. And I've decided to change my vote and to give Canadians an opportunity, or at least a leeway, to start thinking about doing things differently come September 20th.
Maybe I'll just ask you a follow-up question. Are you hopeful that other Canadians will kind of be in the same mindset as you? And do you think that there will be other Canadians who are in the same mindset as you?
So I'm hopeful that Canadians will think about what they're going to do on September 20th. And like I said in a CTV article that I published today, whether that's your liberal candidate that you have looked at their historical record, you have looked at your current options, and you say that my liberal candidate is best for me, so be it. But also look at the other candidates in the same way and really evaluate, think critically about what you're going to do on September 20th, and make sure that that vote is not just you going to ballot box and remotely sort of checking what you've always done before, but think about where the country is now post 2020 in a fourth wave of a pandemic with geopolitical issues happening around the world, and think about what you're going to do. That's all I want.
Okay, Fatima, I'll go to you next. Oftentimes, I'll have specific topics for my show, but this week in the campaign, lots has happened and there's been lots of events. So as I mentioned earlier, you cover climate and social justice the majority of the time. So let's first talk about climate change. Maybe talk a little bit about some of the differences between all of the parties' climate plan, and then also just talk about how big of an impact you think climate will have in this election. Obviously, there was wildfires across Canada this summer, and so many people would think it would play a big role, but how big of a role do you think it will play?
I think it's top of mind, Wyatt, and I think it's because climate change is impacting our society in a way that is undeniable at this point. Like you said, this summer has been the hottest summer we've ever experienced in the planet's history. We just had an IPCC report not too long ago, not even like just a week before the election was actually called, that said that we are some of the climate change impacts are now irreversible. And for us to be able to adapt to them, we have to act fast, we have to act with ambition, and we have to act with a lot of focus and determination in every single policy that we do. So with that in mind, when you look at the party's platforms, the main difference are the targets. The Conservatives are saying they're going to meet Paris, which is 30%, which according to the latest IPCC report is not enough. It's falling far behind from the ambition that we need. The Liberals have increased their targets from 30 to 45%, but there are questions about whether their policies, all of which are the same ones that we've heard in the past, there's not many new policies that they've announced in their climate platform, whether they're ambitious enough and detailed enough and stringent enough to take us to 45% emissions reductions. The NDP and the Greens are aiming for much higher. They're aiming for 50 and 60%, but their policies are even vaguer and broader. So for voters who are interested in climate change, I would urge them to really look at the climate platforms with a fine-tooth comb and understand which policies will actually reduce emissions, which policies actually have the ambition and the effort needed to tackle the biggest emergency of our times, and decide accordingly.
Okay, and Lucas, I'll ask you the next question. So, as I mentioned, this is your second time on the show in under a week, so it's good to have your insight. And so, I'm going to ask you a similar question that I asked you last week. Protesters continue to show up at Justin Trudeau's events. Just today, there was protest outside of hospitals across Canada. And many people are saying that the people going to these hospitals are People's Party of Canada supporters. And so how big of an impact do you think the People's Party of Canada will have on the final outcome of the election? And do you think your answer has changed very much since last week?
Sorry, I was on mute there. Wyatt, I'm so glad that you asked that, because this is something that I've been going back and forth with a long time, which is, in the end, is the rise that we're seeing in PPC support in some polls, not all of them. On the aggregate, it's anywhere between, in the 5 to 7% range, whereas obviously when we're looking at something like ECOS, it's closer to the double digits. And so, can that potentially impact in some of those tighter ridings? Specifically, we're looking at the ones in Ontario. Will that have an ultimately detrimental effect to the Conservatives and potentially give an increase, an increased chance to the Liberals? And I said before I wasn't sure, and I'm still quite not. And I think that the National Post had an interesting story about this, about how some senior Conservatives weren't worried about it yet. There's a little bit of a ... yet. Because you could make the argument that there's some potential upset Green voters with regards to some of the issues that the PPC might be upset about, or those that are not necessarily just conservative, although I think most people would make an educated guess that those would be former conservative supporters that Erin O'Toole really wants to get, especially in Ontario. So I think that the potential is there. And so there is the potential, though, that it could potentially backfire, because you could have the images that the Liberals want, which is they want to create a contrast where if you are kind of on the fence or unsure about who your leader is going to be, and in the end, there's going to be, I think, a lot of voters who are going to say, I've had 6 years of Prime Minister Trudeau, and I have, with Conservatives, a leader who is obviously, Erin O'Toole has been in government for a long time, but do I want to go with a new direction? I've seen Jagmeet Singh for a few years. Do I want to go there? Do I want to change my vote? Or do I see the type of images and what I'm seeing from, as you mentioned, Wyatt, outside the hospitals, and this potential surge that we're seeing in ECOS and double digits for the PPC? Where do I eventually want to go? And am I concerned about that? And so I think that because there's that kind of 5 to 7 range on the aggregate, it definitely has the potential. But if it comes down to an issue of leadership, there actually is an opportunity, believe it or not, with all of the issues that the Liberals have had during the campaign, especially how they fumbled coming out of the campaign, where the Prime Minister can say, he can make it about we, in a sense that, like what Fatima just talked about with climate change, is incredibly important. Look what we've done of where we want to go with meeting our emissions, 30% versus 45%. Childcare, which is a huge issue for suburban voters. Look at the progress we're trying to make on childcare with $10 a day childcare, and look at the potential that we're leaving it. So ultimately, I still think it's a little bit, I'm just not ready to make a firm prediction on how much of an impact it can have, but I think I'm leaning more so that it could make a big difference. It could potentially make a big difference, but the next week is going to be very critical. It's a very long-winded answer to a very simple question, and I apologize.
Stephanie, I'll ask you a question along kind of the same lines. In regards to the People's Party of Canada and their support numbers. Main Street, I believe, did a poll that showed them as high as 10%, which, even if they don't win any seats, they could still have an impact at preventing Conservatives from winning seats. So maybe just, would you add anything to what Lucas said in regards to their support levels?
When Maxime Bernier made the decision to split from the Conservative Party and found his sort of upstart populist movement, I think there was a lot of Conservatives who thought, good riddance. You go and you take all the people who cause us problems every single solitary election, you take them with you. And there's, you've watched Erin O'Toole throughout this campaign try and get away from his true blue self, the way he ran the leadership race and moved the party in a more progressive, I'll use air quotes, direction. And, almost in some sense, pushing that faction now of his party over to Maxime Bernier. But the mandatory vaccination question is almost one, again, where, the Tories clearly didn't handle it well off the top in terms of their response to Justin Trudeau. And it's leading to this question about where do those supporters go? Do they lodge, when they're protesting, when they're lodging a protest vote, they're lodging a protest vote against Justin Trudeau, but they're also lodging a protest vote against Erin O'Toole. They're saying Erin O'Toole is taking the party too far to the center. He is going too far against us. And that has significance when we're talking about the long-term potential for Erin O'Toole's political career. Because the question, a big question coming out of this election is, on election night, if Erin O'Toole fails to form government, can he stay on as Conservative leader? And there's a faction within the party that will say, guaranteed, if he fails, he has to go because he's pushed the party too far to the center. They always believe you have to run as a Conservative, run on Conservative values. That's what gets you government. And he's gone. And so if he has not somehow managed to thread this needle and figure out how to not necessarily have to take ownership of these particular voters, the ones who are upset about mandatory vaccination, because they're not all Conservative. I mean, I was speaking to some Conservative candidates over the weekend, and they were talking about their own struggle with this, that they're tarred, even though they personally are fully in favor of vaccination and may in fact go further than their own leader and support mandatory vaccination. The perception is, oh, these are all Conservatives, but they're not. There's a distinction, I think, between people who are vaccine hesitant, concerned about the vaccine. That's one piece. But there's a second piece that says, I support vaccination. What I don't support is the government telling me I have to do it. That's, that's an argument that kind of resonates with people. Like, no matter what your politics are, you can be liberal, New Democrat, Conservative, and you can say, yeah, I don't want the government telling me I have to do this, and I'm willing to live with the implication. Should I further add, I met people at O'Toole's rallies a couple of weeks ago who were not vaccinated. They weren't, and they were proudly unvaccinated. But when I said, okay, and they said, but I'm good with wearing a mask. I'm good with rapid testing. And okay, I mean, I don't know how you counteract that argument. And I don't know, the Prime Minister is doing a lot of work right now, Liberal leader Justin Trudeau, about making it really divisive and really wedgy. And I don't know how we come back from that. I don't know how on September 21st, any of them give the great unifier speech and anyone's supposed to believe a word that comes out of their mouths.
It's interesting, yeah, on mandatory vaccinations. Obviously, you mentioned some people are who aren't vaccinated are still willing to wear a mask, and then there's some people who aren't vaccinated who are fully against wearing a mask, and those are the types of people that generally have been showing up at hospitals for protests like we've seen today, and at places like Justin Trudeau's events as well. But I'll move on to Celina again. So in terms of, what are some big issues that you think Malia, in your riding on what you said you would be supporting this time, what are some big issues that, kind of made you make the switch over? You mentioned a few of them, but maybe just go in depth a little bit more to chat about some of the big issues that you're passionate about, that you feel Malia Shahid can address better than Ryan Turnbull could.
So let me make a distinction. I'm not necessarily saying that it's better or worse, right or wrong. I'm just saying that I am putting my vote in her this time around. I gave it to Ryan in 2019, and I'm giving it to her. And as a woman of color, as the only woman running in Whitby in this election, I have decided to give her the vote. And I know that Aaron O'Toole, and I've received a lot of criticism from this because they don't have anything in their platform. I am willing to talk to Malia Shahid about racial justice, about what the Conservatives are going to do around issues of discrimination, especially when we think about the Black class action lawsuit around anti-Muslim rhetoric, Islamophobia, around issues related to Indigenous reconciliation. We've heard all of that, or less than enough of that from the Conservative leader. And in terms of me sitting down and talking to Malia Shahid, someone who I think is, as Steph put it, that progressive conservative, I could have that conversation with her and push her around issues that I know are important to the most vulnerable, not just to those who identify from a racialized perspective, but by those who have intersectional identities that are going to be further impacted by inequality, by climate change, by geopolitical issues that are front and center in this campaign. And those are going to be left behind. And I believe that Malia Shahid could have that conversation about pushing that agenda forward.
Okay, and Fatima, I'll ask you the next question. So you cover social justice as well as I previously mentioned. So I'll ask you a question on that and the impact that could have. The story of last year and into this year a little bit, I think, COVID and the election, they haven't necessarily been talking about it as much in regards to, Black Lives Matter and social justice. But how do you think this could still play any part of a role in the election, or how big of a role do you think it will play?
I think people are really frustrated that it's not a bigger conversation. And, we've seen it play out during the pandemic in various different ways. And the one thing leaders have not been able to understand or convey properly is that racism isn't just, when there's a hate crime, right? When someone throws a racial slur at you. Racism can manifest in various different ways. It's about inequality in the treatment of people who are BIPOC, who are racialized and who are Black, Indigenous, people of color. And we've seen that play out in healthcare system where you've had Indigenous people just, be treated so badly. For example, in Quebec, we had a case of the Indigenous woman who was just, screaming for help and didn't get help. We've seen it play out in just the way pandemic supports have been given out, where we've seen low-income, majorly racialized communities be left behind or seen delayed supports being delivered. So we have to have a conversation about racism from an equitable, diverse lens. And I think leaders have really been struggling with that, whether it's climate change or housing or childcare. You can't just have a blanket policy and then not consider the fact that various different communities are going to have various different requirements and are going to demand things in slightly varied ways. I want to use childcare as an example because I think oftentimes when we talk about childcare, we talk about it from the perspective of like a woman who works in a white collar job, like in a company. She might be a manager, she might have her own business, and she really needs childcare so she can continue doing that. But what about all the immigrant women who are working at Canada Post, who also have children, who also need childcare, but they drive sometimes 45 minutes to get to their job, and a bigger portion of their income goes to childcare? Is the federal government framing that conversation so they can speak to those women as well? Quite frankly, no. So I think people are frustrated where we're in 2021 and Canada is still struggling to talk to the diversity that it is so proud of. And that's what the problem is. And with 5 days left, Wyatt, I don't think that's going to change. But whoever comes into power next, whether it's the Liberals, whether it's the Conservatives, majority, minority, whatever the structure is, I think government needs to seriously take stock and understand, how are you actually talking to Canadians, and which Canadians are you talking to? Because I can bet all of my money you're not talking to every Canadian, and that needs to change.
I'll go to Lucas, and then I'll go to Stephanie. So Lucas, in terms of the Greens, they seem to be in some trouble. They had internal conflict that's either been put to rest or put on hold. I was talking to Evan Sullivan earlier today, and that was something that we were talking about. Is that's kind of one of the biggest unknowns right now, is we don't necessarily know if it's just on hold due to the election or if it fully is put to rest. So maybe you can speak a little bit about that, and then also just talk a little bit about the Greens platform in general, and you know, the chances of Annamie Paul winning her own seat, and anything really relating to the Greens and to their platform.
Well, I think it's very unfortunate the way that Annamie Paul's tenure began from a leadership point of view. I think it's one of the most disgraceful starts to a leader I've ever seen. I'll say one thing about the Conservatives. A lot of them didn't like Andrew Scheer when he took over, and a lot of Conservatives didn't like Erin O'Toole when he started. But I can tell you that they get behind their person. And if they don't like them, that they'll try to do in a quiet or a subtle or a covert way as not to make a big issue. And what happened to Annamie Paul, and I don't just say this because I'm Jewish either, it was give her a chance. And she started out 5 blocks behind where she should have started. And that has had an impact because it takes your message, not just as the leader, but the party off message. And the way that she was not galvanized behind. And I'll be the first to say that there were some issues early in her leadership. For example, you talked about trying to win her seat, Wyatt. I'm not sure if trying to get that seat in Toronto is ultimately the best strategic move. I go back and forth of whether she should have sought maybe a safer possible seat, but that's the decision that she made, and she should have gotten the full backing, the full support of everybody in that party. Give her a real shot, and that didn't happen, which is why her performance at the debate is so critical. Because in a moment when she finally had that attention, she didn't have that distraction, which is another reason why I thought that the Prime Minister's response to her when he said, "I'm not going to take caucus manager from you," was an entirely terrible note. But I don't want to get too far away from your question. I think it's great that she's campaigning outside of the city. I think she's great that she's campaigning outside of the city. I like the fact that she's in Prince Edward Island. And you'll notice that she did something very interesting in the debates, Wyatt, when she talked about those issues that were beyond climate change. You'll notice that she kept trying to bring it back to a question, whether it was regards to something like childcare, whether it was regards to an issue about of social justice, whether it was an issue about leadership. She brought it back to those particular topics. And so she's been able to find a way to talk about a specific issue that isn't necessarily climate change and keep the focus on that. She's incredibly level. She is rock solid steady. So she needs to continue to present that, even though there's a week left and she's decided to travel now. We would like to see a little bit more. She is doing everything that I think she can right now to try to win her seat and try to support the other candidates who have potential opportunity. And it's just, to me, as I said before, I think it's a shame that there wasn't a more focused approach at the very beginning, so that she wouldn't be as behind the 8 ball as she was coming up. But she's in the position she is, and she's obviously going to do the best that she can.
All right, Stephanie, I'll go to you in 1 minute. I do just want to get Celina's insight on this because, you know, you were mentioned in the English language leaders debate when she said thank you to Jane Philpott, Jody Wilson-Raybould, and yourself. So maybe just give a little bit more insight on the same question I asked to Lucas, and just in regards to Annamie Paul and the Green Party, how big of an impact do you think they will have? And do you think they could possibly take some votes away from the Liberals, from people that have sort of the same mindset as you, but just, I guess, in a different way to where they're considering the Greens?
Mm-hmm.
So that was an emotional moment, and I appreciate it. But you could see from my reaction to Lucas that I loved every part of his answer. I just sent him a Twitter message just saying exactly that I loved every part of his answer. There's nothing more that I could add. I don't know if she can gain enough ground to take those votes away. She is trying with all her might, and I give her the utmost respect for not throwing in the towel, for not giving up. She will not give up. I texted her after the debate, and I've been texting her throughout this entire moment. We don't have to agree on policy to support each other. What is happening to her is downright wrong. What has happened is downright wrong. I don't know if it's paused, but I respect Lucas's answer, and I will co-sign on Lucas's answer, everything that he said.
All right, Stephanie, and I'll go to you. We haven't talked a whole lot about the NDP in this panel so far, and so how big of an impact do you think they could have on the election? Do you think they could be the party that prevents Justin Trudeau from winning his majority? And just furthermore, how do you think they will define success in this election?
These are all great questions because they're existential ones for the New Democrats, and they come up again and again and again. And much like, for the last several elections, we've all been poised to say, okay, this is the moment the Green Party is going to finally do it, man. They're going to land it. And then along comes enemy, and everyone thinks, okay, this is it. This is it. They've got it. If any election, it'll be this one. And right. And so the question comes around again to Jagmeet. And where is he in that cycle? Is this, the pundit class and probably all of us here will say, listen, the New Democrats in Canada are never going to form government. It's highly unlikely. That could be true. It could not be true. I don't know. But ever since the days of the Orange Crush and Jack Layton sweeping Quebec, better has always been possible, to borrow a phrase. And they did very well in that election, but they capitalized on a very unique set of circumstances. And that circumstance was the absolute collapse of the Liberal Party. And that's the same thing that gave, Harper his majority, was the absolute collapse of the Liberal Party. So the question then becomes, who are the NDP? Are they just like the nation's spoilers? Are they the conscience of the House of Commons? Are they the place where progressives go when they say, I just can't with the Liberals anymore? And I think there's a lot of people who are just cannot with Justin Trudeau. Like, they're just so done with him. But they cannot park their votes with the Conservatives either, for a variety of reasons, because no matter how progressive Aaron tries to be, there's a lot of questions there, right? A lot of concern. So, somebody said, I think very early on in this campaign, that the Jagmeet was making a lot of inroads and he was making a lot of connections. He was coming across as very real, very authentic, more so than in a previous campaign. He'd found his legs, all of these things. But what hasn't he done? He hasn't moved the polls. He's raising his floor, but not his ceiling. He's bumping up polls in certain places. British Columbia, I can see Celina's like, what are you talking about? British Columbia would be one place.
Totally agreeing with you. I'm like hyping you up.
Oh, okay. I was like,
this is my hype moves.
British Columbia is definitely a place where the New Democrats are poised to make a breakthrough. And in terms of denying the Liberals their majority, because the Liberals, they did, I think it was 2015. You guys can correct me if I'm wrong. It was 2015. The Liberals had a historic breakthrough win in British Columbia. They won more seats there than they had in forever. And that support got eroded in 2019. And now I think it's really poised. The NDP are really going to, have room there to surge and grab more seats. And they split the vote. I mean, that's what they do. And what they allow to happen is for the Conservatives to come up the middle. And in places like Hamilton, I mean, how many times are all these federal leaders going to go to Hamilton? How many? It has seen more leaders than cars at a Tim Hortons drive-through. Like, they're going to be there again and again and again, because there's places where the vote is going to split and it could give the Conservatives a win. So for Jagmeet, what is victory? Victory is obviously increasing his seat count. Victory is winning seats that maybe they haven't held before or haven't held recently. It would be great. There was a brief glimmer of hope that Ruth Ellen Brosseau, the star of the NDP Orange Wave, was going to come back and make a comeback, but it seems as though maybe that's not going to happen because of the dynamics of Quebec politics. That's too bad for Jagmeet. So I think for him, to pick up seats, to continue, if we're really heading towards a minority government, for him to have more share of the vote in the Commons. And he's already said he'll dance with anyone. So he's a kingmaker. He's positioning himself to be a kingmaker yet again in Parliament. And it'll be interesting to see it. I expect in the next couple of days, we're going to see the Liberals pivot very hard on this argument that a vote for the New Democrats is a vote for the Conservatives, because that's a classic strategy for them. And that's sort of, I think, in some places where they're going to need to go to convince NDP voters to go to them. Except, like I was saying before, think a lot of voters have just had it with Justin Trudeau and they don't buy it. They'd rather vote for the NDP, have a strong minority parliament, because we presume that all Canadians like a majority government, right? We presume it. But maybe most Canadians actually like it when it's like this. It's horse trading. It's you get stuff done. You can, everybody's views can be better represented perhaps than a majority that can just do whatever the hell it wants whenever the hell it feels like it.
Yeah. All right. Well, Lucas, Celina, Fatima, and Stephanie, thank you all so much for joining me. And it's great to be able to have good conversations about the election that will impact so many people. And yeah, thanks all for joining me today.
Thanks, Wyatt.
Thanks everyone.
Wyatt. Bye, everybody. Have a
Great
good
job,
night.
Wyatt.
Bye.